Let's talk about biomolecules. First of all, what are they? Well, they're four of the main constituents of your body that helps your body function and you function as a human being. But within this diversity of biomolecules, four main types to be exact, we have to ask ourselves, what exactly do they have in common? Well, they all contain the element carbon. Now, you might be asking yourself, why? What's the use of carbon? And for that, we have to take a deeper look into carbon's molecule itself and the element itself. If we look at carbon, we can see that it has an atomic number of 6, meaning that it has 6 protons and it has 6 electrons. And from what we know about valence shells, well, the first one contains 2 electrons. It has housing space for 2 electrons. And the second valence shell contains space for 8 electrons. So let's do the math. If we have 6 electrons, the first outer shell is filled, and in the second outer shell, well, 4 out of the 8 electrons are filled. Meaning that for carbon, it can create 4 different bonds with other elements. 4 different bonds with other elements. Now, why is this important? Well, it ensures that there is a huge versatility within carbon itself. Attaching to 4 different other types of compounds or elements allows it to have an increase of versatility itself. But now you might be asking, if carbon houses 4 out of 8 electrons, how come we don't have other elements, let's just say lithium, who only house 1 electron in their outer shell? Couldn't that create an entire 7 bonds? Well, the answer is unfortunately no, because in many cases, when we have a valence shell such as lithium, and we'll note the outer valence shell with an E minus, in most cases it doesn't take the time to form the other 7 bonds. Instead, what it does is it simply gives away its electron. But for carbon, with an equal number of 4 on both sides, meaning that it either has to create 4 bonds to complete its outer shell, which all elements want, or it has to give away 4 electrons to complete its outer shell in a lower level, it's always the same, meaning that carbon is forced to create the most bonds as possible. And now, with that in mind, what exactly are the 4 biomolecules? Well, first, we have carbohydrates. Secondly, we have proteins. Third, we have nucleic acids. And lastly, we have lipids. And some key definitions before we go on any further, we have to take a look at monomers and polymers, and what exactly they are in context to biomolecules. Looking at the stems of monomers, we can see that it has the stem mono, which means 1, which means monomers are simply one part of a polymer. What is a polymer? Well, poly means many, so it's many monomers. We can think of it in a more analogous way when you think of it like building blocks. A monomer is just one building block, while a polymer is a cascade of them, all attached together, in many cases by what we call dehydration synthesis, but that's another concept we can get into at a later time. Overall, taking one block and putting them all together, you can make many enormous things like a castle. And so, with the definitions of monomer and polymer in mind, we can move on to our first biomolecule, the carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is made out of 3 main elements: carbon, like we all know, which is present in every biomolecule, hydrogen, and oxygen. And now, for the shape itself, we can see that many carbohydrates, and mostly all of them, are shaped in a ring-like structure. And you can see this internal ring of carbons and oxygens, and it branches off from there. From what we know about the monomers of carbohydrates, they are called monosaccharides. Mono, of course, meaning 1 again. And then from there, we know poly means many. These are nothing but polysaccharides. And now for the main functionality of carbohydrates, what they use and what they're best known for is quick energy, which means that right before a run or right before a long marathon, it will supply you with lots of energy you need for the near future. And we can see many of this in starches and sugars. Starches and sugars. And from our evolutionary ancestors, these carbohydrates were actually quite favored because in the short term, they gave them the necessary energy to go out and hunt or even go and escape from other predators. And it's overall a quite important biomolecule itself when we're looking at many people such as pro athletes or even people who simply want to go out on a marathon or a half marathon because it provides them with necessary energy to go complete the task. Then on to the next biomolecule or proteins. These, on the other hand, contain another element. In addition to carbon, they also contain hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And its monomer is the amino acid. And the polymer, on the other hand, is a chain of amino acids, in which we call polypeptide chains. And this is a mouthful, but just like these polymers and monomers of proteins, the shape itself is also quite complex. The thing is with proteins, they come in a multitude of shapes. For example, many complex proteins have B-pleated sheets, another very complex concept that we don't know how to get into, and other A-helixes. And overall can look quite complicated if you look at it from an X-ray crystallography standpoint or any sort of device that zooms in on these proteins. It's made up of a buildup of many polypeptide chains, overall comprised of amino acids. And overall, you can see that this shape itself is quite complex and at times can even look quite random. But sometimes proteins can look as simple as a block or chain of amino acids. And the thing is, these all look so complex because they have a complex functionality. It has a wide range of functions, a wide range. And to name a few, they help move things in your cell, move cellular products. They can create enzymes, which are catalytic products that carry out many reactions in your body. They can make up antibodies, which help fight infections, and they can do so much more. The function of proteins is essentially endless. They do essentially most things your body needs. Most things your body even needs, which is why they're so complex in the first place. But after proteins, we can now move to a very important biomolecule that many of you may not recognize at first, but then recognize later as we move on, the nucleic acid. In addition to what we saw in proteins with carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, it also contains phosphorus. And the monomer for a nucleic acid is nothing but a nucleotide. And its polymer is, well, a nucleic acid. Now, these nucleic acids come in two main shapes, the first of which you will instantly recognize, in what we call deoxyribonucleic acid, also known as DNA, in its basic shape of a double helix and a very basic, non-complex way of drawing it. Here is a small diagram, but DNA is actually much more complex than this, made up of a sugar phosphate backbone and the nucleotides and nucleic bases we see here. Nucleic acids can also come in the form of RNA, or a single stranded DNA, essentially complex, in which it's also made out of nucleic bases, or what we call nitrogenous bases. And its functionality is essentially to store genetic information, which is important to, well, you contributing to your phenotypes, but also helps carry out protein synthesis, What DNA basically does is that it gives the cell instructions for protein synthesis or the making of proteins, which are so essential to all functions of life. And after nucleic acids, we have lipids, last but not least. And lipids is quite a simple molecule. And for starters, it doesn't have any monomer or polymer. There's absolutely none. And its shape, on the other hand, is also quite interesting to see as well. It has a main glycerol head, and a string of fatty acid tails protruding from one side. In this case, we call this a triglyceride. Triglyceride because, well, 1, 2, 3, these all have 3 fatty acid tails. And the functionality is also quite wide range. From what we know about the cell, lipids make up the cell wall in what we call phospholipids, which simply contain a phosphate group, which looks something to the likings of this. A phosphate group, and that's at the head of the lipid itself, but it also makes up fats, such as shortening and other things like butter. And overall, what it does is that it stores long range energy. Long range. Which means that over time, this can slowly give out energy when your body needs it in the future. And it stores itself as fat. What happens basically in fat is that once your body needs a surplus of energy, instead of having carbohydrates which release quick energy, it will look to lipids, which have been stored in your body after excess concentrations of energy has been consumed, and instead it gives its energy at that time. And with this basic overview of the 4 main biomolecules, we come back in a full circle. With a good basic understanding of biomolecules and their functionality within the human body, we can take a closer look into the specifics and how they truly transcend into the world of biology. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful rest of your day.